and we should be ready to start our webinar. We're going to give a minute or two here for people to start joining the group. I see a few people have already joined us. So for those of you who are here, welcome. We are going to do a webinar. If you've seen our webinars before, you will know that you won't be able to talk, sorry. If you're new to the webinars, what we do is you'll be able to see us and hear our presenters. Then if you have any questions, use the chat function. I will be moderator, so I'll be tracking your questions or comments and be able to share that with the presenters as we go along. Feel free to use the chat freely and often. And we are going to get started here in another minute or so. We just want to make sure that we give people enough time to join us. And the webinars are always recorded. They are available in the OWHE Yahoo, not Yahoo, I'm sorry. I don't know why I'm talking about Yahoo, YouTube channel. And so if you want to revisit any of the information to share with you today, you can certainly do so by watching the recording. Also, we encourage everybody to utilize your social media and encourage you to use our hashtag, which is OWHE webinar. And we welcome any feedback and press that you give for our webinars. And actually, we'll put that in the chat box right here for anybody who might come in a little later. That's how we use the chat, so feel free. I'll be looking for your comments. And I think we have a few people here. Perfect. We'll go ahead and get started with our presentation. So I'm going to turn it over to our presenters so they can introduce themselves, and then we'll enjoy their presentation.
Okay. Hello. Thank you all for joining us for our presentation on cultivating successful transitions with our peers. I'm Cherise Bunn. I'm an International Student Coordinator at Lynn Benton Community College.
I'm Caitlin McVeigh. I'm an International Student Advisor at Oregon State University.
And we presented this at the conference, the Oregon Women of Higher Ed Conference in January. And so we're asked to share it with you today. So we're super excited about that.
So we're going to go ahead and share our screen with you and get started.
So for a little bit of background, Caitlin and I first met in April 2015 when we were working, or both just completing our master's programs in student affairs. And so when we started working together at the international office at OSU together that summer, we bonded over the fact that we were having rough transitions. So it was through those transitions and my transition even to Lynn Benton Community College that we decided to take a deeper look at transition theory and investigate ways we can support our peers through transitions. So to start out, we wanted to share the roadmap with you of what we'll be talking about today. So we'll start out learning with the learning objectives for the presentation. After that, we'll spend some time talking about Nancy Schlossberg's transition theory. From there, we'll move on to talking about the transition process itself, what that looks like. And then we'll talk about some of the common difficulties and proactive support strategies that we can use to support folks we work with in their transitions. We'll finish up with some time where you all can ask some questions of us. So please make sure that you're sharing your questions with our colleague. Yeah. Okay, so the learning objectives for this, we really do hope that all of you get something out of this. I know that Caitlin and I both learned a lot, even just by researching it ourselves. But through this presentation in particular, we really want you to be able to identify your personal professional needs when transitioning in your career. Think about if you are going to go through the transition, what you would need, and also if you know of people who are transitioning into your department, what they might need. To examine various transitional experiences women face at our institutions, and also to construct a toolbox of ideas to increase the success of professional transitions. Because we really do believe that there are ways to make transitions much better and even much more pleasant, I suppose. So when talking about transitions, I like to look at Nancy Schlossberg's transition model. Schlossberg's theories are core theories in student development and higher education. Both Caitlin and I studied these theories in our graduate program, and are excited at how well they apply to working in higher education as well. When Nancy Schlossberg writes about how she first developed her transition theory, she talks about an experience she had moving. As she was moving geographic locations, she realized how much she was experiencing a lot of angst. She was baffled by how she could struggle so much with something she chose to do. As she began to study transitions more, she realized that transitions are inevitable and that, like her, most of us actually experience some form of angst when transitioning. That stress is incredibly normal. And so that's why she actually identified this model and coping strategies for how to work through the transitions. So Schlossberg identified 3 main transitions in a person's life. The first is anticipated transitions. These are what you imagine are going to happen. For example, leaving to college, starting a new job, leaving work for maternity leave when you've had time to prepare for it. And then there are unanticipated transitions. So these are the unexpected ones that force changes. These could include unwanted pregnancies, a divorce, or something else like that. The third type of transition is a non-event. So there are 4 types of non-events. The first is a personal non-event, which is related to an individual's aspirations. So this would be like if at work you did not get the promotion you wanted, or you were counting to get into medical school or get into a certain doctoral program and you didn't get in. So that would be a non-event. Next is a ripple non-event. So this is felt due to a non-event of someone else. So the example on the screen we had is like your child had a miscarriage, or perhaps you've been waiting for your child to get into Harvard and you find out they're not accepted. A resultant non-event is caused by an event. So here we wrote down that a colleague at the same level got a raise and you did not. Another very common one is when a colleague leaves your department. So even though you're not transitioning out of your department or out of your institution, a colleague that you've worked with for 20 years might be leaving, and that has a real effect on your coping. So the final type of non-event is the delayed non-event. So this is when you're anticipating an event that might still happen. So for example, if you were hoping to join the Peace Corps and you were delayed, you didn't get to leave when you were expected to. Or sometimes this happens for our students. It takes an extra term to graduate when you expect it to be done at a certain time. So as you can see, these are all different types of transitions, and there's very different circumstances attached. But they have very real effects on each individual. So what Schlossberg did next was to look at the 4 S's. So these are the 4 factors that influence one's ability to cope with transitions. So the 4 S's are situation, self, support, and strategies. So situation entails the trigger that anticipated the transition. Timing has to do with whether the transition is on time or off time for a particular person. So if it feels like that's what you should be doing at that time in your life. Control, what aspects of the transition is perceived to be within one's control. Role change, is the person's role being changed, and is this seen as a loss? So is there some sort of a grief attached to that? Experience, does the person have experience with a similar transition that will help them cope with the current situation? So if this is the first time you've ever worked, like a person who's transitioning to a new institution right after their graduate program versus somebody who's worked in the field for quite a while in graduate school would have very different experiences that help them cope with the transition. Concurrent stress, these are the other sources of stress that are present. And so a good example of this I like to think about is, so somebody who's leaving, maybe just graduated from graduate school and is moving across the country for a new job, and perhaps that person is also married or just got married for the first time. So there's a lot of different factors in there that can be stressors, and so how that person copes is going to be very different than somebody in a different circumstance. The final one is assessment. So who is actually seen as responsible for their transition and how that person's behavior affects the person. Next, we have self. So these are the personal and demographic characteristics of a person that affect how we view life. Along with this, we have the psychological resources such as outlook and values. The self factor takes into account how a person makes meaning of life through outlook, etc. Next, we have support. So support includes the intimate relationships a person has, family units, networks of friends, institutions, and communities. Support really can be built up, but when a person is entirely new, they may not have the support they need in a particular area or situation. The final S is strategies. These are the coping responses. We have a few strategies to help with transitions. The first is to modify the situation. So, for example, you can change the timing to fit your needs. Tackle concurrent stress. You can do this by exercising, eating healthy, getting counseling if you're changing multiple life roles at once. So that example I used of that person who was moving across the country and also just got married and also had all these other things, reaching out and getting this sort of supports there would be really good. The second response is to control the meaning of the problem. It is possible to come up with alternative meanings for the behaviors. So rather than assuming the worst of your new colleagues, assume good intentions and think of the various circumstances that likely affect their behavior. The next one is to not take things personally. It's important to realize that not all things revolve around us as individuals. Someone criticizing an orientation, for example, is not doing a personal attack, but possibly is attacking a process. Also, see it as a growth opportunity rather than a challenge. Adopt a growth mindset. When you do this, you're constantly on the road to success and improvement rather than in the depths of despair. The last one is to manage stress in the aftermath. So exercising, eating healthy foods, getting counseling, spending time with the people you care about. As you can see, the 4 S's take into account many factors. All of these factors actually help us work through the transition process, which Caitlin will now share with you.
Okay, so Schlossberg worked with many different researchers throughout her time working on this model, and one of those was with Chickering in 1995. And so in that work, they came up with the transition process. And that included 3 stages, so moving in, moving through, and moving out. An individual is likely to go through many transitions in a lifetime. So we're going to go into more depth about what typically categorizes each stage in the coming slides. But I wanted to first share this visual of what a lifetime of transitions looks like. As a person progresses through life, she'll go through several transitions back to back, such as attending college, entering the workforce, starting a family, retiring, many in between. So the first stage of the transition process is called moving in. Individuals in this stage are often at the beginning of something new. For example, their first job after college, changing to a new field, a new institution, or a new role where they gain new projects or duties. Moving in doesn't always necessarily mean moving up. However, as a demotion can also mark the start of a new transition process for someone as they adjust to their new role. So let's think about this from the perspective of a woman starting a new job at a new institution. During the moving in stage, she's still working on finding her way around campus, remembering everyone's names, getting keys and access codes to be able to start working. She may be struggling with feeling out of place and unsure of her qualifications for the new job. Maybe she's acquired some unexpected duties that she isn't quite prepared to handle yet. Perhaps she has questions but isn't sure who she should ask. Think about this from the perspective of a promotion. This person may be feeling a mix of excitement and accomplishment at gaining a new title, but she may also be feeling overwhelmed by the lack of celebration or recognition of her new role. Take this and compare it with a demotion. So what do you think would be different in that situation? And what might be the same? The moving through stage is the part of the transition process when people settle into their jobs and make meaning of their work. This is the middle. People in this stage of the transitions may still be distinguishing between old and new processes, learning expectations and behavioral norms. They may even be navigating the new behavioral norms set by others who join the team at a later stage. People continue to transition and adjust throughout their time in a particular position or role, and there are challenges that come with that. This is also a time when a lot of non-events may occur. For example, a woman who's been in her position for a number of years may expect to be promoted and begin that new transition at some point. If a promotion does not occur during her expected time frame, she may end up mourning a loss of something expected that never came to fruition. She could be feeling a sense of grief because she was expecting to be given more freedom and responsibility, and she did not get those opportunities. People in the moving through stage are no longer considered new on the job, but they're also not yet on their way to their next transition. So during the moving out phase, people have begun to consider making a new transition. They may just be wrapping up a project to pass off to a colleague, or they may be researching new opportunities, applying for new jobs, or preparing for retirement. The interesting thing about these stages is that they tend to flow into each other. So while somebody is moving into a new job, they may still be trying to move out from the previous one. The tensions between the new and the old, the moving in, moving out, can leave a person feeling like they've left things unfinished. They may have a hard time letting go of their previous role. Teammates may also have a hard time letting go when someone moves out from a workplace. For example, when a new woman may join a team, and her first months are marked with comments about how the last person in her position did things a little differently. She may be tempted to call the previous employee for assistance or guidance with the project that was passed off. She may even continue to receive phone calls, messages, or emails for the person who left the position. Much of Schlossberg's original work focused on retirees and how their transitions differ from each other. For example, a woman who's nearing the age of retirement and has decided that she will finish out in the next year will have a much different experience moving out of her position than a woman who's forced to retire early due to unexpected circumstances. The transition process will likely be different for each individual in each situation, as a number of factors have an effect on how the transition process is perceived and handled. So with that, we'd like to take some time to discuss how we as peers can ensure that others make successful transitions in and out of our institutions.
So now that we've looked at the different pieces of the transition process, we want to think about how we can ensure successful transitions for our peers. One thing we know that as peers, we cannot have a direct influence on the self and strategies factors in another person's transitions. However, we are able to affect the situation and support factors. By working to support our peers, we not only provide a safe environment for them to join, but we also support ourselves and fellow colleagues by changing the scene a bit to make a new, fresher environment. That said, we want to go over some of the very common difficulties that arise when folks transition to and from institutions. One of the most common factors, difficulties nowadays, comes in the form of generation gaps. As digital natives enter the institutional workforce, we are continually forced to change the way we do things. Students from Generation Z communicate faster with fewer words and more emojis. It's imperative that in higher education, we begin to adapt our processes and communications to meet the students' needs and fit with the time. In practice, this can cause issues. When you have someone who has worked at an institution for 30 years doing things one way, and another person joins the team who wants to get with the times, there can be walls built up immediately. This is tied closely to the second bullet point. Folks like to create traditions and thus develop a strong resistance to change. So some of the things we hear from peers might be like, we've always done it this way, or this was here before I started here. Just think about it though. Just because something's been done one way repeatedly doesn't mean that it's necessarily the best way to do it. An unfortunately common denominator is the lack of dedicated time or resources. A new person might be starting during a busy time of year, but to be quite frank, if you're bringing someone on to your institutions, it is crucial that you put time and energy into making them feel welcome. Walk them around. Give them 5 minutes of your time to talk about their weekend. Don't go straight to your computer to check your email. It is the person's first day. Take them to coffee. Ask them about their weekend. Make them feel important. Another pretty common difficulty is that there are different realities between what was perceived from interviews and actual realities. This can be on both sides. During interviews, people are putting their best foot forward. They're not talking about the difficulties openly, for the most part. The interview team may have also oversold the institutional culture, and the person realizes this on the first day that the culture doesn't fit that person's needs. The final common difficulty we thought about are the structural differences between institutions. Folks moving from semester to quarter systems might struggle a bit. Also, working at your first community college when you've never attended one could also cause culture shock. And though these difficulties are common, we definitely believe that there are ways we can all support one another through them.
So considering some of the common difficulties Sharice just mentioned, we've got a few ways that you can affect an individual's perception of their transition process. We talked briefly earlier about the 4 S's, and while you can't necessarily affect someone's perception of their self or the strategies that they use to adjust to a new transition, you can potentially affect the situation and support. So that's what we're going to talk about here. So when considering the different factors involved in the situation of the transition, definitely think about timing. A new employee will have a very different experience and a very different impression of a workplace if they're onboarded during a slow part of the year versus during a fast part of the year. While we can't often control the timing of when one person is has vacated a position and that position needs to be refilled, we may have some flexibility with when we advertise, when we ask for the new hire to begin. If you know that you need someone ASAP, but you're not going to have time to properly change the person for a few months, are you really saving yourself much by asking them to start earlier without the proper training? The duration of employment and language around how that's conveyed to the employee can be very important for your team as well. If you want someone to fill a temporary vacancy while another person is out on maternity leave, or there truly is no opportunity for continuation after the allotted time frame, try to be as transparent about this as possible. However, if the temporary job is likely to be extended or is dependent on passing through a probationary period, that's also important for the employee to know from the start. Misunderstandings about expectations for continued employment can cause resentment on the one side and anxiety over leaving a team in a bad position on the other. Schlossberg's research showed that uncertainty, particularly around the duration of a new transition, can have a profound effect on stress levels and may determine the degree to which the transition is viewed negatively or positively. Concurrent stress, while often outside of our control, may have a great impact on the success of the transition. Your team may be able to affect those stressors more than you think if you're able to determine what they might be ahead of time or help the individual prepare. For example, if a person is moving in from a new area, they may need to find information about appropriate housing, transportation, possibly childcare, and local school information. Provide as much access to resources for the new person as possible. Does your HR department have a new employee resource list that you could provide? They may also be bringing a spouse with them. Find out if your institution is able to offer spousal placement programs for new employees before making the offer, so you know that this is something that could be negotiated or not. Remember, the offer is just the beginning of this person's transition process, and see what your team can offer to help make a smooth transition. So providing adequate support to an individual in their transition process may be the most obvious way that we as peers can ensure successful transitions for our colleagues. There are a lot of great resources out there you can access simply by Googling the ideas listed on this page. Intake and outtake checklists, great ways to help new employees settle in and make them feel like they have a purpose for the first few days of their transition process. They can also be extremely helpful when moving out from an institution. Most HR departments have a version of this to help people turn in keys, parking permits, and the like. And it'd be great to take these lists and create a more department-specific type of checklist for your employees. Everything your team does to assist with someone's move out, such as asking questions to help them tie up loose ends or pass on projects, will ultimately assist the next person with their move in. Having a schedule formed for the first few days while employees get their devices and emails set up, sending that out beforehand so the person has an idea of what will be required of them when they start their new position, also is extremely helpful. Include the name or names of people who will be their designated guides for this new employee. Maybe include a picture of these people too, because we all know that names are hard to remember. This is helpful because it gives them a person to go to with questions. When you're scheduling a person's first few days, be mindful of scheduling in some downtime for the person as well, because they're going to need to sit down and take a breath. We all know that first days can feel like a whirlwind of activity, running back and forth from meetings to meetings and trying to remember a million new names, and it can be good for the new person to know that it's okay for them to just sit somewhere and collect themselves. If you've scheduled them to have lunch with the team, put in a little downtime later in the afternoon. Additionally, social engagement opportunities, both within your department and the institution broadly, help new employees adjust to their new environment. Let them know about upcoming opportunities and make sure they know it's okay for them to go to those events. Most HR departments have a new employee training. Get your new employees signed up for the earliest possible training so they can start out their transition process smoothly. Did you know that many HR departments also have ongoing trainings aimed at helping employees with the other stages of their transition processes? If you haven't checked these out for yourself, these trainings might be a good way to refocus and continue to engage with your work in meaningful ways. This is similar for mentorship opportunities and professional development opportunities. Mentorship is not only a great way to help a newcomer adjust and learn in a new position, but it can also help an employee in later stages of their transition to learn new skills and renew their commitment to the job by serving as mentors. So goal setting with meaningful follow-up can be a good way for your team to check in with the new employees, make sure they're developing the skills they need for the job you're expecting them to do. These can be formal or informal evaluation processes that make sure that the employee knows which type of evaluation to prepare for so as not to cause excessive stress. Finally, ritual and recognition events are important for every stage of the transition process. One thing we learned from last year's conference attendees was that meaningful ritual and recognition events may look different for different employees, so it's important that you keep the individual in mind when you're planning this type of event. For example, someone who's uncomfortable being in the center of attention may be happier with a small display of appreciation upon moving out from a position rather than an extravagant party. It's important that you know your person. With many proactive support strategies, it's important to remember that these may only be small factors affecting the way a person adjusts during a transition. It's most certainly not a one-size-fits-all procedure. But by employing even some of these support strategies in your institutions, your efforts will not go unnoticed and you will likely have a happier workplace overall.
So with that, we wanted to share this thought with you. Transitions are inevitable. And in fact, I would argue that transitions allow us all to grow and change in our profession and as individuals. And we truly believe that together we can support our peers to create effective supports that empower individuals as they transition to and from our institutions. So here's a quick look at our references. We included some resources that institutions have created to help people transition into their institutions. We had handouts when we did this webinar at the conference in January. And so these are just a small smattering of them. But we would, like Caitlin said, I encourage you guys to Google it and just find ways that you can create these sort of tools for your new employees, because it's really important. If you want to keep your employees, it's super important to do that. And as you may recall, both Caitlin and I started working on this presentation because of incredibly rough transitions in. So we are huge advocates for creating these sort of platforms that help individuals in their careers. So with that, we wanted to say thank you. That's a picture of us on a fun trip we took. And we wanted to open it up to any questions that are out there.
We're going to stop sharing our screen right now so you can see us.
Oh, there we are.
Yes. Wow, that was more information on and thinking about transitions that I have ever thought about. So I think that was very helpful. Just so many things I just never even thought about in regards to that. But then things that I can identify through some of my transitions that haven't been as smooth as I would have wished. So while we're waiting to see if anybody else has questions, let's see, we have a comment. Great presentation. You've given me a lot to think about, right? Very useful. I think so too. So I've noticed lately, I've seen some posts from people that have show their welcome packets at their institutions, and mainly they've been, kind of corporate, get all kinds of fancy things. But as you were doing your research, I don't know if you found anybody in higher ed who's doing a particularly good job of welcoming and helping staff transition? Because I've been in higher ed for about 16 years, and I think all of my transitions have been trial by fire, right? You get in there, you start doing. So I wonder if just so happened as you guys were doing your research, did you find any institutions that you were like really on it and were doing a good job?
I know of one small thing that, I mean, it's a personal thing. This isn't research related, but one transition that I just was baffled by how amazing it was when I started at OSU as a GTA, as a graduate teaching assistant. My supervisor actually had an entire, she sent it to my colleague and I, my friend Lauren. We had our entire first 2 days planned out, and she had us planned out to when you go to the university day, when you're going to go to this, when you're going to have lunch with the big department. And I didn't realize how unusual that was until I actually started like learning more about how unusual that is. But that was honestly, and maybe it was partially she put that extra work because I was a student and, you know, very student development focused. But when you get that kind of attention, you feel like you matter. So
yeah, I'm a little bit like you. Every transition I've had has been rocky, I guess. And I think that's the nature of transitions to some extent, but you know, one of my move out, so this wasn't necessarily higher ed, but I was a teacher, English teacher in Japan for about 8 months. And the private company that I worked for, they had this really fantastic exit package. It gave you all the paperwork that you needed to submit, and it gave you directions on like how to return the keys to your car, how to make sure that you wrapped up everything at your schools, and how to make sure that you paid your taxes if you needed to, and take care of everything with the city, and end your apartment contract, all of those final bills, when you were going to get paid, your final paycheck, and how that was going to get to you. And that was so, it was so thorough that I was like, I just look at this email, this is how I'm going to leave this place. And because it was such a big move for me to move from one country to another, it was really important to me that I had that thorough exit package. But I haven't really seen anything like that since. It's kind of, you know, everybody's busy, everybody's trying to get through their own transitions, that it's hard to, or it's easy to forget that, oh yeah, this person's probably going to need a little extra support around those initial moves in and moves out.
It just, and one thing I think about too is like, because people do need that extra support, like if you think of what we do for students and how we support students, like, so we talk about, you know, how you get students to college, how you treat them, like how you're wanting to keep them that second year, how you're wanting to help them through to graduation, and what you do at graduation, like how beautiful is that? Because we create this beautiful experience, and yet for some reason we don't take the time. And it, to be honest, it's not like days you have to spend doing some of this stuff, but we just don't put that emphasis on it because it's just like, you're here, you do a job, and that's sometimes what it feels like. And I think the at least the people I've talked to at different institutions that have had the best transitions really like end up staying longer because they actually feel like, oh yeah, like I can buy into that. This is my place. These are my people, and I just think that's so important. And I don't understand why we don't have it in higher education if we're supposedly using higher, you know, like student development theory.
I know, right? We could do some work on that. Okay, we have a question. What do you think staff can do to encourage the creation of a more comprehensive transition program at their own institutions?
Well,
that's from Sandy. Thank you, Sandy.
A good starting point is always when you have a person coming in, right? Because that's when people are like, oh yes, let's talk about let's think about this. We've got a new person starting in a month. And start to bring up those pieces of it, like, oh, well, do we want them to, how do we want their first day to be? How do we want to hand off the projects that they're going to be? Maybe form a task force if you want, a small welcoming group that's in charge of that person's transition. I think that would be probably the best way to divide the work, because I feel like a lot of the time a team will say, yeah, we're really excited for this new person to come in and we really want to make sure that their transition is smooth and that they're able to take over the role, and somebody else will actually take care of the details. But then if I think that and Sharice thinks that and everyone else in our group thinks that, then none of the details actually get taken care of. So
yeah, I definitely think so. If you're trying to talk about changing that culture or create this transition culture, it's almost like, you know, I feel like sometimes supervisors and managers and everybody, like, they love the ideas, right? And they'd be like, yeah, let's figure out how to do that. And so it's really like, make sure you have the buy-in, right? But then also, and what manager really wouldn't want there to be some sort of support for the people they supervise, but then also have somebody who has the time or has the creativity to take charge of that, and then just kind of build a team connection for it. Because it seems like there are people within different places I've been, at least, who could do that. So yeah, as long as people, you know, throw it out there and try to work on it.
well, and I think that the thing to remember is that, you know, we used a theory to base this presentation around, but we all have experiences with rough transitions and possibly good transitions as well. And so draw on your own experience and remember what worked for you, what didn't work for you, and bring that to the table. Try to think about that ahead of time and bringing it up in a group setting so that you can get everyone on board and say, oh yeah, I've had something similar to that. So let's make sure that doesn't happen for this person.
Yeah, and one of the things too, thinking about some of what we shared earlier, that non-event or resultant transition where it's like somebody actually is leaving and so that affects you. I think with new people coming in, that is also a factor usually, like, right? So like the person who's been there forever, who knows how to do everything, is gone. And suddenly it's like, what are, you know, like that affects the person who's worked for them for 10 years. Like you feel a lot, like that's grief. There's grief attached to that. And so making it more of a community building thing rather than like a building blocks, sort of like, let's have our own stations somewhere, like try to create it to be more cohesive.
Oh, I think
I can't hear you.
I think you're muted.
I muted myself and forgot about that. But I think you're completely right. I'm thinking about some of the experiences I've had in institutions that I've worked in, and I think we kind of had those grand ideas of even doing surveys. Well, if you, what do you wish you would have known when you first started at the institution? And so we put all that work, we send it out, that we collect the information, but it feels like more often than not that we didn't do anything with it. So it was kind of pointless. I think just having that institutional commitment to make that change and really be invested in creating the culture, like you were mentioning, is an important step.
And I think we didn't really talk about this very much, but when you have somebody who's responsible for a position, so say that person's the supervisor, that doesn't necessarily mean that the supervisor has to also be in charge of that person's transition. Because if I'm transitioning into a role and there are, you know, I'm one of 4 advisors at Oregon State University. So if I were new in that institution, I wouldn't necessarily need my supervisor to be my guide. It could easily be one of my colleagues who's doing the same kind of role as me and would know, oh, these are the things that you should know. These are the things that you're going to want to be aware of. The other thing that's, I think, an easy go for is somebody who has transitioned into your institution recently is probably going to be, they're going to have the most present ideas for how to help a new person come in after them, because it's pretty fresh at that point. Depending on how long it's been since they started, you know, they're going to remember, oh, this is what was hard for me. Like keys are so hard. I could not find my keys. I could not get them to unlock my door for weeks. So, you know, those people, use your resources that you already have. You don't have to recreate the wheel.
Yeah, I think when we worked at OSU together that summer, she was the new person who helped me out a lot, and she had somebody who'd been there like a month longer, or like maybe the same time, but those were the people that helped navigate it.
Yeah, I think that for me, because what my colleague started a week ahead of me, and so my transition to Oregon State, the positive parts of that transition were that I had someone else who was going through the same feelings or similar feelings that I was. Like, oh, how do we get our email accounts to work this week? Okay, so we're at the same page. So I think that can be a helpful support too. Having, if you have more than one person starting around the same time, then make sure that they know each other and make sure that they interact and have time to kind of debrief on their transition experience, even if their role was completely different.
Great. Let's see. I don't. If anybody has any other questions, you can use our chat function. We haven't had anybody else write anything for a little bit, so. But yeah, I think this has been really helpful. And I think I'm a manager, and I can feel almost the pain that I have put people through because I have not been very strategic in getting these things done. And even here at PCC where I'm at, HR has been kind enough to give us a checklist, especially for when people leave, so we can follow that. And I still make a mess of it. And so now I'm feeling guilty, right, of how I have made people feel as they're exiting the institution. So I think it's something to think about, and like you were mentioning, really worthwhile to work at and invest that energy. So.
And I think don't beat yourself up because nobody's perfect at making a transition happen. And the thing is, you could be the most perfect, you could provide the most perfect materials and supports for a person, but there's still three other factors that Schlossberg identified. And two of those you can't have any control over at all. So there could be so many other things going on that are affecting that person's transition process that you don't know about and you can't change if you wanted to. But I think putting the effort in, showing that you care enough to try and support that person and help with their situation at the forefront or at any point in the transition process, they'll notice and they'll be thankful. Something I was going to mention earlier, so we pulled this theory from student development theories because both of our grad programs have the same books. We're in different schools, but we use the same books in our programs. And this is a theory in the student development theory book, but it was actually developed more in the workforce originally, right? Schlossberg mostly did work with retirees, work transitions. So I really don't know why this isn't more broadly used.
Yeah, it was interesting because I mean this does apply. It applies to every transition. Like it applies to motherhood, it applies to starting a new job, it applies to students, it applies to retirement, and just thinking about how we're supporting or how you can help out with that, because there is a lot that has to do, there is a lot that has to do with the self and how that person's interpreting different things. And that's why, we talked about how this, you can kind of reframe the situation where it's like, oh, they're not laughing, they couldn't be laughing about this weird outfit I'm wearing my first day of work or something. There's some of that you can do with the transitions, but definitely there's just so much, they're so applicable to everything. I feel like if you haven't read Schlossberg, read this one and Marginality and Mattering. My recommendation.
Great. Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate you taking your time out today and sharing your presentation with us virtually. And really, really great information. I think what I've had other presenters do is share their PowerPoint. So if you guys are able to share that with me, I'll send it out to everybody who registered, those who were able to attend and those who were not. And of course, I'll share this link to the recording so that way people can revisit, and as they're thinking about everybody who's going to go out there and start really planning for transitions, they can utilize this great information.
Great. Thank you so much for having us.
Yeah, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. And thank you, everybody out there who's watching us. Bye-bye.
Bye.